Welcome everyone to David Dudley Outdoors, and I'm excited about today's topic because we're going to be talking our wood crankbaits, ones that may be built out of balsa, maybe built out of pine. Are wood crankbaits better than plastic crankbaits? And when it comes to bass fishing and catching a lot of fish on a crankbait, I know there's a lot of crankbaits that aren't built the same. Whether you're dealing with plastic crankbaits or wooden crankbaits, we're going to talk today about wooden crankbaits, maybe where their flaws are at, and also we're going to talk about plastic crankbaits and maybe what you need to pay attention to when you're dealing with plastic crankbaits. So let's start off with wood. Wood crankbaits have been around forever. And I can remember, just to tell you a quick story, I can remember years ago reading in old Bassmaster magazines, FLW magazines, where the crankbait legends like David Fritz, you had Gerald Beck, you had Jeff Coble, David Wright, some of the North Carolina crankers always would say, man, this crankbait right here is the best crankbait. I put a black dot on it. And then they're like, swear by that one wooden crankbait. And then you'd hear another one, I'm going to go hire a scuba diver and get that crankbait back out of that water because I've caught 39,000 bass on this one crankbait. Okay, that's what got us started to thinking about all crankbaits are not the same. And they were true. They were fair in saying that, but I'm going to explain to you what was going on. When they would put that black dot on a crankbait, it truly was a special crankbait for the fact of the way it was built. Not all wooden crankbaits can be built the same, and I want to discuss that. And I want to discuss, are wooden crankbaits better for catching finicky bass? You've heard this rumor of wooden crankbaits. You know, I switched to a balsa crankbait versus a plastic crankbait, and that's what it took to trigger a bass to bite. Okay, so we're going to discuss that also. So let's talk about inconsistencies with a wooden crankbait. So as you can see, if I was a manufacturer, I'm going to have a piece of wood and they're just going to start carving out, bodies, right? They're just carving out rough draft bodies. This is the general shape we're going to want it in. And then they're going to grind it and sand it down, and it's going to spin on the design machine, and out comes a wooden body, whether it's balsa wood or other kinds of woods, okay? So here's a design. It's on a piece of wood. Now, here comes the inconsistency with wood and why the crankbait legends of the day would swear by this crankbait was better than this crankbait. I'm going to explain to you why. Because of this. Basically, you have a piece of wood, and in some wood you have denser wood versus not as dense of a piece of wood. You have knots. As you can see, there's a big knot in this piece of wood. You can look at the grain of wood that's different. And basically what I'm telling you is maybe they carved out a piece and the tail end of that wood was a knot. I don't know. I'm just saying, or a dense piece of wood. So what's going to happen is, instead of that crankbait having a wobble like this, if you're looking at it from the backside, with the heavier, denser piece of wood, it was weighed more, and instead it's going to go like this, right? The lighter the back of the wood. So when you're dealing with wood, it's an inconsistent flow throughout this piece of wood, which is going to cause your crankbait to do crazy things. Not all wood's the same. So another example would be, let's just say you had whatever a piece of balsa wood. Same example. You're going to have a piece of knot, it's not going to be as buoyant as the same. You can buy the 2 identical pieces of wood crankbaits that you're going to throw when you're catching bass around lay down trees, and you're catching bass around structure, you're catching bass around stumps, and you want it to back up. You want a high floating balsa crankbait or whatever it may be, and yet you broke one off, grabbed another one, and you're reeling it and it's kicking off to the left. So that kicking off to the left, if that knot was on this side of the crankbait and it's heavier this side, when you reel it, it's going to go to the side. It's going to go to the side. It's going to go to the side. You understand? I think I've explained it enough. You're going to understand what I'm talking about. And actually, in the thumbnail that you saw, this is one of those Bagley Big O's, man. It's got teeth marks all over it. You can actually see the wood inside of it. Wood chipped up on the side of it. That sucker was a legend in his time. It's now retired. I know a lot of people use them as collection items or whatever. So, there's your wood explanation. Now let's jump over into the plastic crankbaits, okay? The modern way of making crankbaits right now is the plastic world. Now remember, we're going to discuss the differences in wood and plastic, where some people think wood catches them better than plastic, but we're also going to discuss how to select the right plastic crankbait if you are in the market. So there's a few different things I look for when I am looking for a plastic crankbait, and I want to take a second right now. Guys, if you are in the market for shopping for crankbaits or tackle, check out fishermancentral.com. That's fishermancentral.com. It is an enormous store, has all the specialty items, everything that you're looking for, okay? fishermancentral.com. So when it comes to plastic crankbaits, here's what I want to tell you. That not all plastic crankbaits are built the same. So I'm going to be looking for a plastic crankbait that is a high floater, and I want a plastic crankbait that I know is not a high floater, but say like a medium floater. And then there's crankbaits I want that are sitting heavy in the plastic, which I know is going to get deeper, and it's going to get me to a depth that I want it to get to. So I'm not going to sit here and give you David Dudley specialty crankbaits. There's a there's a lot of options out there, but let's talk about the difference. If I'm wanting a high floating crankbait, there's 2 ways I can tell that. There's one way, if I throw a plastic crankbait out there, I'm reeling it, I use the same hooks that I use, I'm going to look, reel it down, and I'm going to look and see how fast if it backs up or if it rises straight. There's a difference in a plastic crankbait that comes in, backs up, and floats this way, or a plastic crankbait that comes down and goes, is on the rise. So you got one that's rising straight, one that's going backwards. I want both. I want both scenarios. I want one that's going to back up. The ones that back up are typically the ones that I'm going to throw around wood. And then you have the ones that are just high rising. Those are typically something I'm going to throw around rocks or just flat, if I'm cranking in flatter areas or wherever I may be at. That's what I'm looking for that. So a couple different things I want to show you. Let's start off with this. I'm going to take right here, I'm going to take a tool and I'm going to cut a crankbait. I'm going to cut a crankbait in half and show you what I'm talking about. So watch this. I reckon I should have wore safety glasses. Don't do that at home without safety glasses. All right, so now we're going to look at plastic crankbaits. Plastic crankbaits are going to naturally come in different gauges, okay? And if you can see, this was a square bill I cut up. You know, I don't have a micro, something to give you the exact measurement of it. But what I mean by plastic, there's differences in plastic is that there's different gauges. As you can see in this one, it's actually a really thick gauge. Naturally, this is a deep diving, but you also have thinner deep diving crankbaits where they put the weight transfer system where they're using thinner plastic and using the transfer ball to make longer casts. This is kind of your older typical style. This is some of your modern day square bills. As you can see, they have different gauges of plastic and thickness for it. Now, when it comes to plastic, there is no inconsistency with plastic. It's an injected mold. Now, we talked about wood. It's not an injected mold. The plastic that gets injected into a mold is that if you buy one crankbait, it's exactly the next one you buy is exactly the same. Unlike wood. Now, I'm not against wood, guys. I got a lot of wooden crankbaits in my box. If you were to see my some of my crankbait boxes, you'll understand that I have a lot of wooden crankbaits, like anywhere from the old Bagley baits to some of the plastic baits that I throw. And I'm not going to sit here and favor one or the other. So let's talk about this. This is kind of the myth we've heard of. Do wooden crankbaits catch more bass than a plastic crankbait? So you've heard the rumor that they're a little bit more quieter. You know, I switched to a wooden. What? Don't feed me that magazine talk. Don't feed me that, hey, I want to do an article. Can you talk about crankbaits? And I talk some bunch of baloney about a wooden crankbait. No, you're not going to convince me that a wooden crankbait is better than a plastic crankbait because they all make the same amount of noise. There is no such thing as a silent crankbait. Impossible. Because what happens is the hook and the split rings on the nose and on the eyelets, they are rattling like crazy. When you reel a silent crankbait by you, it's still making all that noise when it comes by you. There's no such thing as a silent crankbait. There's silenter crankbaits, which means this one definitely, if it's silent, it's saying, hey, this one don't make as much noise as this one, which a silent crankbait is extremely loud, and a one that has rattling system in it is definitely extremely loud. So when it comes to choosing a crankbait, whether it's a deep diver, shallow diver, if you're comparing wood to plastic, I'm going to summarize it up like this. Plastic is going to be the most consistent crankbait out there. If you buy a certain brand of crankbaits, and you always have to check to make sure they're tuned right, because it's not the inconsistency of the plastic, the eyelet may be off, so you might have to tune the nose one way or the other to get it to run straight. A lot of crankbaits don't come out the box running straight, but a wooden crankbait can come out the box running one way and it runs another way, not because of the eye, but because of the inconsistency in wood. So my summary is this. What am I going to choose when it comes to plastic versus wood? I don't really care. I really don't. There's some wooden crankbaits that I love the paint jobs on them. I love it. I'm not choosing a wooden crankbait because I think it's silent. I'm not choosing a wooden crankbait because I think it's the best thing. Actually, I'm more scared of a wooden crankbait than I am a plastic. But you just got to know your plastic crankbaits. You have to understand the plastic. You have to understand which companies have the better fit for what I'm using it for. I'm going to throw a certain plastic crankbait on rocks. I'm going to throw a certain plastic crankbait for wood. And I have a certain plastic crankbait for deep diving. Guys, pay attention to your lures. Guys, I appreciate it. Hit that thumbs, share this video, hit the thumbs up, guys, if you've liked this, and definitely hit the subscribe button. I got a lot more of these videos coming at you every week, multiple videos every single week. Make sure you check out the description below. You can actually find out the lures I like to throw, fishermancentral.com. And if you have any lures that you want me to test out, you want me to look at and maybe showcase on here, look in the description. I have an address that you can send baits to, and I will check them out and maybe give you a shout out. Thank you guys, and I'm out.